Today, we're making the Rhode Island Clear, my favorite clam chowder that emphasizes simplicity and the wonderful, wonderful flavors of the clams. It's extremely easy to make and you can have the whole thing done in 30 minutes. So let's do it. First order of business, we deal with the clams. Now, for me, the best way to make sure that there is no sand is to have A, more water than you think you need, B, you salt it quite generously. I know people like to say as salty as the sea, but just eyeball it. Don't make it too salty. Because from experience, that would actually end up making the clam juice salty. Give it a mix to make sure they're fully dissolved, and you lower the clams. And after about 15-20 minutes, you lift out the clams without pouring the liquid away, so you could gauge how much sand, if any, are left in the clams. So we set this aside and we start preparing our second hero of the show, the pork. Now in New England or Rhode Island, you'd be using unsmoked salt pork. But here I want to propose my preferred version of the pork, which is guanciale. If you've ever made carbonara, you'll be very familiar with this. It is the jewel or the cheek of the pig, salted in a more gentle manner compared to the salt pork, and it has a richer, more buttery texture that I think adds more complexity to the chowder without overpowering anything. So if you live next to an Italian supermarket, give it a shot. If not, use salt pork, but just make sure you rinse it in water to avoid adding too much unnecessary salt to the finished product. The only extra step you need to do is because guanciale is cured not just in salt, but in different herbs and spices on the surface, that is. So we need to very carefully trim off the surface to avoid adding too much flavors to the dish. So you want a similar amount guanciale lardon to onion ratio, and since we're using one onion, we'll do this much. Carefully remove the skin. Make sure you're taking all the spices. I mean, New England Clear has clear in its name, and it really is a pale colored soup, meaning even during rendering of the fat and the cooking, we want to add no color to the guanciale or to the onions. So, generous lardon size. Straight into the cold pan. We bring in very gentle heat and we start to render out the fat without browning. If time permits, the best way to do this is to actually start with water, so that while you render out the fat, the water gently evaporates and you end up with the best product. But for time's sake, I personally just like to add a small dash of olive oil to get this started. I mean, it is a dish of Portuguese influence after all, but if you want to be a bit more authentic, use butter. While that's happening, we prep the rest of our ingredients. First up, an onion. This would add a lot of sweetness that will be reinforced by the clams themselves. And again, similar sized to the lardons that we've just made, so not minced. And periodically we move them around to avoid any color. Now, we peel our potatoes. This is always the order I cook this dish, because by the time you finish prepping your ingredients, the two stars of the show are normally ready. More. Now, we dice them. Once again, similar size to the lardons. So, to prevent oxidation, if you have clam juice, that will be the best liquid to add to this, to avoid any unnecessary dilution of flavors. But since we're making our own clam juice with the clams, we'll add the world's smallest dash of water, just enough to cover everything, to prevent turning the clear soup into a brown soup. And of course, we've reserved the starchy water because that's what we're going to add to the final product. Now, the onions and potatoes are ready. We check on our clams, which by now has had about 15 minutes. Very carefully lift. Today we're using Palord clams, which is a European variety. If you're in the States, cherry stones, quahock would be amazing for this recipe. As you can see, we have practically no sediments left, so we know The clams are good to go, and we now cook the clams and extract the clam juice. Unlike a vongole or any other of my clam recipes, the objective of the exercise here is very simple. You want the liquid and you want to cook the clams to perfection. So we don't even need olive oil, the garlic, the white wine. We're simply going to add a touch of water to help this form steam. We lower our clean clams. I mean, if you have a steamer, this is even easier. In a fine dining situation, of course, restaurant would try to extract the clams raw by freezing them briefly, removing them that way. And because the final product will be cooked anyway, so this method is sufficiently good in my opinion. Once the water's boiling, lid on, and you keep it at medium-high heat for about 5 minutes. You'll first hear the popping sounds, and when the popping sound subsides, that's when we open the lid and check. I'll see you then. Right, once the popping sound has subsided and your whole flat smells like the sea, high tide sea that is, we open the lid and we grab 2 bowls, one for the flesh, one for the shells, to make sure we don't overcook the clams. Reserve all the clam juices, basically pick out all the ones that have popped open and give the laggers a bit of time to catch up. There's this misconception that clams that do not open are dead. It's quite the opposite, because the muscle that is alive is what's holding the shells together. What you ought to look for are clams that are open before cooking. Right, it's getting hot, so we switch. This is how I would cook clams in general, meaning fishing them out as they open so that you avoid overcooking them too much. Alright, the last one, the lager. Let's bring in some heat. As you can see, the clam juice, completely clear. We're offering a 5-star service to the lagers. When you're ready, sir, ma'am, open enough, stove off, lager out, clam juice ready. Now, let's sweat some onions. As you can see, I got slightly overly excited. So instead of the Rhode Island Clear, we have the Rhode Island Mostly Clear. But the fault is mine. So one optional step, which I normally take, is I want to skim off the excess fat. You can always add them back in, but for me, it's a clam dish, not a pork dish. We don't need that much pork fat. So a thin layer. And remember, when we cook this, the guanciale would render out even a tiny bit more fat. So we bring some heat back in and we add the onions. Because of the salt content from both the guanciale and the clams, I'm very reluctant to salt at this stage, and I normally prefer adjusting the seasoning at the very end. What we want to do now is using gentle heat to evaporate the water content of the onions, concentrating their flavors, the sweetness in particular, which will be reinforced by the clams. So while this is sweating gently, we remove the shells, and they're just the perfect doneness, which we'll set aside and add to the finished product. So you have all the flavors from the clams, but not chewy clams, like the Logan Airport version. So, of course, it's important to keep an eye on this. Move them around. Perfect. Depending on how much longer you need, you can wrap this in cling film, just to avoid them drying out. But since our onions are almost translucent, we can skip that step. Now, once the onions are mostly translucent, and we don't want to evaporate out all the water content because then they'll start to brown, we add our diced potatoes along with the starchy soaking liquid. I always do it in this order because then I know how much solid ingredients I have and how much liquid I need, if any, to top up the wonderful clam juice. So once you've formed the even layer, we grab our clam juice, and just to be on the safe side, we grab a small sieve and we add the clam juice. Really, the soul of this dish. Brilliant. And just as if we've measured it, no dilution required. Now we bring this back to a boil, lid on, we switch back to medium-high heat, and we simply cook until the potatoes have softened. About 15 minutes. I'll see you then. Alright, after 15-20 minutes, and I like my potatoes on the crunchier side, we have this beauty. Give it a mix. The combined smell of the clams and the guanciale is just incredible. And just to check for the doneness of the potatoes and the salt level, we taste. Wow, this is quite remarkable. Now, we simply add back almost all of our clams. Save a tiny bit for presentation's sake. You don't have to. By the way, if you're using the larger varieties, I would chop them up to make everything bite-sized. And the residual heat will be enough to warm the clams through. So there's no need for the stove to be on. Perfect. Let's plate one, shall we? This clear soup really is a lot of Portuguese immigrant influence. Of course, a bit of presentation clams everywhere. And that's it! My personal favorite clam chowder. This is the Rhode Island Clear. I really hope you enjoy. White wine.